We now come to the reading of God's Word, and we ask God's blessing upon our time in the reading and the proclaiming of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The reading today is from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. This is the word of the Lord. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as we went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is God served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Because God has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them. But some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. We have heard the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Move? Meh, more. There are common reactions to the words we share with others. Sometimes those words stick and sometimes they fly like a lead balloon. Three common reactions are found in this passage as people respond to the message that Paul has proclaimed to them. I need to move along, and I'd like to know more. You can't control how other people react, can you? Can you? See, I can't even make you disagree with me right now. Listen, like any minister, I've had mixed reactions to the same message, and sometimes those mixed reactions are just me. But sometimes I have people say, I didn't get what you were talking about, or this is not for me. Sometimes people just say, okay. And some people say, I want to know more. And occasionally people will say, I was thinking about what you shared a couple of months ago. I've been thinking about that, and this is how it's influenced me. Sometimes people remember, sometimes they don't, and sometimes people agree at once. These are all mixed reactions and are to be expected. Many years ago, our church decided we want to be a place for all people, full stop. And for some, that was not earth-shattering. For some, they accepted it. But let me tell you, for others, when they hear that there's a church that would accept them, no matter what, no matter what their faith is, whatever they've gone through in life. That message is life-giving, it is refreshing, and it continues to make an impact even this past week, which I'll tell you about at another time. But God continues to work, though we are not meeting together. But it takes time. Listen, the work of ministry and building a thriving congregation does not yield immediate results. But let me tell you something. No word is wasted if it is blessed by the Spirit. No word is wasted if it is blessed by the Spirit. There will be moments when people say, I'd like to be a part of your community. I'd like to be a part of your church family. And of course, our job is to keep telling the story, keep inviting, keep explaining why we believe what it is that we believe about God, and then to keep the doors open. Well, metaphorically keep them open right now, but literally later on. I want to make one big point from this passage that ties together what I just explained to you. And it's this: how you think about God influences how you think about others. Okay? How you think about God influences how you think about others. And how Paul thinks about God influences how he views his audience. And you'll see that he uses a very evocative image to get his point across. And it opens doors for people to follow and to ask more questions. Now, Paul is on a mission to take the good news of Jesus Christ to people who have never had the chance to believe. And in this instance, he has left Jerusalem, he is traveling the Mediterranean, and now he finds himself in Athens. Now, Paul was a very influential Jewish rabbi and was also a Roman citizen who came to faith in Jesus Christ. And so his habit was to go to a new city. He would teach in the synagogue about Jesus, and Jesus being the fulfillment of the scriptures that were read that day. And then he would go to the public square. Our text says, and Paul argued with them. But the Greek word that is used there means to argue, like reasoning something out. It's like a dialogue, not a monologue. And let me tell you, this is real life, right? Ministry continues because the phone is ringing. I'm going to let voicemail pick that up, but I'm not editing this video. So our text says Paul argued with them. So he is just dialoguing with them. And so you can imagine a situation in which Paul gets his point across, and then they say, yeah, but what about this? What about that? And so then in the synagogue and in the marketplace, and then in the public square, more and more people gather. And then by the blessing of God, enough happens to where a church is then constituted. It's an amazing work. Now we call that church planting, which I've done before. And it's a really wonderful thing to see God build a cohesive church together through the simple relating with one another with kindness, praying and being there for one another, and the preaching of the gospel. As Paul walks through Athens, his heart is troubled. He sees a city teeming with people and ideas and all of these architectural marvels. But he also sees a city groping in the darkness, desperately looking for God. No wonder his heart is troubled. Everywhere he turns, he sees idols or images, imaginations about God. Now, it's interesting to me that Paul doesn't criticize them. It surprises me because most of Scripture roundly condemns the practice of making an image of God. But in this situation, Paul seems to see it differently. He sees this image making as a desire of the human soul, that it's a desire that rises out of the human heart, that there's some kind of impulse within us that says there is something bigger than our own human life. So embrace the gift of life. Embrace the giver of life and respond with reverence and gratitude. Paul seems to say that this desire to image make comes out of the human soul. to not take it for granted and to show reverence. So Paul goes to the synagogue, then he goes to the marketplace, and the message that he's sharing about Jesus and the resurrection is so different that the people say, let's take him to the town council and convene a meeting and invite him to share more. So they bring him to the Areopagus. He's not in legal jeopardy. They just want to hear him out. Paul doesn't throw a bunch of Bible verses at them. Did you notice that? Paul doesn't just start throwing out a bunch of clobber verses at them and tries to just beat them into the ground with the Bible. But he actually quotes a few of their own poets. Now, maybe a few of us would expect him to quote Bob Dylan with "You Gotta Serve Somebody," but Paul quotes Epimenides, who wrote that God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And then Aratus, who says that we are God's offspring. Paul quotes their own poets back to them, saying, this is a familiar thought that you have. This is kind of your spiritual roots, this searching, this thinking about God. And it's important because it reveals a side of Paul that we often miss. And it's a side of Christianity that is beautiful and mystical. That God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And did you know that there's only one other time that we've experienced that? There's only been one other time that we've experienced that. We live and move and have our being. And it was when we were in our mother's womb. Imagine it. It was there, it was there in the womb that we lived, we moved, we had our being. As Aaron Cast wrote in an article for Peripateo, which is a Christian discourse journal, she wrote, "The mother is the world of the child. The child knows no existence outside the mother. The woman is the ground of the child's being, and from it flows life. The mother cannot help but to sustain the child, and the child cannot help but remain in the womb." So you see that we are living, we are moving, we are having our being, and also there is provision, there is love, there is care. We are being watched over it, yet we did not even know it. Even when we were born, we had to learn her voice and her name and to trust that all would be well. Even when we didn't realize it, we were held, we were looked at, and we were looked over. Now, Paul tells his audience, and what we want to tell our friends and our neighbors and all who happen to hear these words, your soul is sending signals to you that there is something more, that there is something and someone more, and you're searching. And sometimes groping in the darkness is what it feels like. Trying to find something on this earth that does justice to the beauty and the mystery and the meaning of life. And the answer is in God. Paul tells them, you are deeply religious, you are searching, you even have an altar dedicated to the unknown God. What a beautiful concept, that they are so religious that they want to make sure that everyone is accounted for. An altar dedicated to the unknown God. And Paul says, I'm here to tell you that the unknown God knows you and has taken on flesh and has dwelt among us. And we see and we finally recognize the face of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And it is in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that we find the words that show us the shape of God. Of all the images Paul uses, he used the image of a mother's womb and our being surrounded and cared for by God, but not realizing it. Now, what's the result of Paul's preaching? What's the result of Paul's preaching? Some scoff at him. Some say, I want to hear more. And some begin to follow. Dionysius actually becomes a prominent bishop in the early church. We do not know where our words will land, but the seed falls, and with God's blessing, it takes root and flourishes. Now, last week I said you are not a performer in front of a cosmic judge. Paul, in this passage, says, hey, God has appointed one person to be the judge over all things, and he has given proof by raising him from the dead. And that's what they're scoffing at. But what does it mean to be a judge? Well, the council that Paul is standing in front of, their job is to judge. Their job is to judge. But they judge sometimes in ignorance, meaning not that they're not smart, but sometimes they judge things even when they don't even know it. And Paul says here, God knows you. God knows all things. God knows that in him you live and move and have your being. And he has vindicated Jesus Christ to show that very fact, that not even death itself keeps God from you. So God is the ultimate judge. And God knows all things. And so why would you not want to know this God who knows all things and knows you? To me, it is a very compelling passage. And so, like Paul and so many other Christians, and including Christ himself, we want to talk about a God who is engaged with the world, who deeply cares for us, who knows and who loves and who gives and gives life. Now, surely we are all brothers and sisters. Now, as I close, obviously I'm here in my office. You may hear the ambient noise outside from Hooker Avenue, or you've heard my phone ring. But earlier this morning, actually just before I started filming, I got off the phone with a dear person from Poughkeepsie. She was calling for the loan closet. She's helping a friend get the equipment needed so that she and her friend can bring her friend's mom home from the nursing home. And then she opened up. She said, Pastor, I was diagnosed with COVID-19 and I almost died. I was diagnosed on March 28th and I am just now okay. She then told me of her experience. She actually had a false negative, and then the doctor said, we should probably test you again. And so they did. She talked about how scared she was. But she said, but Pastor, I know who keeps me, I know who watches, and I know that God was with me no matter what. She was overflowing with gratitude for the kind people in her life that have supported her, and for the medical personnel who treated her. Her life continues to be difficult in several other ways, which I won't share here. But in my heart, I say a special prayer for her right now, asking God to uphold her. So as I put this passage and that phone call side by side, what I feel is that she is literally my sister, that we are brothers and sisters from the same God. How we think about God influences how we think about others. I don't know about you, but sometimes I grow really weary about the division in our country and how antagonistic we are at times. And I just really hope that during this time that there would be a spiritual awakening within our people, within our citizens, that we would become more compassionate, that we would be more forgiving and more understanding, and that people can move past anger to where they could see the person, the true person, standing in front of them. But listen, here's the truth. It begins in the church house. It begins with people like you and I making a decision to live a certain way. Right? I mean, it begins with us living this message out. We don't have to berate and we don't have to talk down to people who think differently than us. Paul exemplified that. But we can be people who find common ground. Listen, ministry still continues even though we're not meeting together. That's just one story, but there are others, and there are other phone calls that have happened this week. And so as you continue to pray and support, do not grow discouraged. Do not grow discouraged. God is still working in our hearts and in our congregation, in our community. And we will be together one day, but we can still worship God. As Paul says, God is not far from us. God is not far from us. And so, friends, God is the one who is the source of life and love. And to that same God, we give our thanks and praise. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.